who have converted what has been a regular event series here at the Miller Center into a series of webinars. We've all been working pretty nonstop with enormous creativity and ingenuity to pull this off. This is a new series on Thursday at 10:30 this week. Bob Bruner from the Darden School, David LeBlanc from the College of Arts and Sciences, and David Smith from the McIntire School of Commerce are together going to do a webinar on the developing economic crisis and the pandemic. I'll moderate that conversation. And the three of them have been working on the history of financial crises for the last several years. We did a series of events in 2018 and 2019 to mark the 10th anniversary of that financial crisis. So I really encourage you to attend that. Today, we're here to discuss the Trump presidency in 2020 in both potential meanings of that phrase. That is, looking backwards, if hindsight is 2020, what have we learned about the presidency over its first 3 years? But since 2020 is also the year we're in and an election year, and we're nearly 1/4 of the way finished with that, how should we think about where the president currently sits? And I'm sure on everyone's mind, given the coronavirus pandemic, what impact will that have and the president's managing of the crisis have on the coming election campaign? We'll start with a basic assumption, and that is that the presidency is the hardest job in the world. At the Miller Center, we try to bring the lessons of history forward to inspire leaders today and tomorrow. So the framework that we'll use looking backwards is one that we developed for our first year project. About 5 years ago, we launched first year 2017 to draw the lessons of what presidents have done in the past for what any new president should do coming into office. At the beginning of a president's first year, they are at the height of their political mandate, but at the depth of their experience. They have to assemble a team, establish processes, pick their priorities, manage the politics, particularly with Congress, and promote their personal popularity. So what I'm going to do today is track the Trump presidency on these 5 different dimensions, and then come back around and talk about where we stand today. Let me start with personnel, which is the basics of governing. Any president starts by assembling a team. I'm going to show you a clip from a forthcoming documentary that the Miller Center is producing in partnership with VPM, the Foundation for Public Media in Virginia. It looks at the Bush 41 presidency and how that president and his team addressed a series of crises. It's based on a series of oral history interviews we did shortly after that administration ended. And we just went back in the last 2 years and re-interviewed the senior leaders of that team in preparation for the documentary. So please play the film.
George H.W. Bush was probably the most qualified president in terms of foreign policy in our history.
The first thing he did was to pick individuals who knew each other and had worked with each other in prior iterations.
George Bush comes into office and brings with him one of the most experienced foreign policy teams the country has ever seen.
The Gang of Eight starts with the Gang of Four, if you will, the president, the vice president, chief of staff, and the national security advisor. Brent Scowcroft, myself, the president, and Quayle. After inauguration, the group of 4 added Jimmy Baker. Occasionally, Bob Gates came in. And as soon as Cheney became Secretary of Defense, Cheney was brought in. We eventually started bringing in Colin Powell.
The Bush foreign policy team is seen as the gold standard of foreign policy teams. Were quite experienced with one another, but they were also very wise in the world.
The Bush people come in, they correctly actually recognize that just continuing the status quo won't work. The Reagan people don't really have any pending new ideas on the table that are very good. They need to actually craft a whole set of new ideas, and in some ways more ambitious ideas.
The review of U.S.-Soviet relations that my administration has just completed outlines a new path toward resolving this struggle. Our goal is bold, more ambitious than any of my predecessors could have thought possible.
There was always a commitment to being bold in the changes that we were going to propose, and it was Brent Scowcroft that led in terms of the magnitude of the change the president would propose.
And I have chosen as my national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft. He understands the White House, he understands the military, the State Department, the way the Hill works, and the intelligence community as well.
It's the president who has to feel comfortable with his team. I don't believe I'm particularly difficult to get along with.
If you looked in a dictionary and said perfect national security advisor, it would be Brent Scowcroft.
I will return to the role of the National Security Advisor and White House staff in a moment, but let's first focus on the cabinet. Sorry here. This chart shows how quickly previous presidents have moved to establish their cabinets. The chart shows the 5 most important cabinet agencies, particularly if you have a crisis. And what you will see in white are the badges representing the State Department, the Defense Department, the Justice Department, Health and Human Services, and the Treasury Department. If you have a crisis, those 5 agencies are essential. You'll see in blue the deputy secretaries of those cabinets. So what you will see for the Trump administration is that they moved relatively quickly in confirming their cabinet. Most administrations get it done by the end of January. The Trump administration had a relatively chaotic transition period between Election Day and Inauguration Day. But they moved pretty quickly to get all of their cabinet secretaries confirmed. It was where the deputies, and then below that, the assistant secretaries, where the Trump administration really lagged. What you see here are those key agencies and other agencies and how many senior officials have been confirmed today. That is below the cabinet secretary level, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, and other confirmed positions that fill out the federal government. These are the essential people who carry forward the authority of the president as confirmed by Congress. So in advancing any particular issue or in responding to a crisis, different cabinet agencies have to be brought in. And during a crisis, you want those senior leaders focused. At the bottom, you'll see the Department of Homeland Security, which has been important in this crisis for screening passengers coming into the country from China or South Korea or Europe. And the chart indicates that only 35% of the assistant secretary level positions have been filled with confirmed officials. Just to give you a sense of what that looks like in the senior reaches of Homeland Security, the cabinet secretary is an acting official, the deputy secretary and undersecretary for management are both vacant. Various other key officials are acting, which actually means that their actions are quite prescribed because they don't speak with the authority of the administration. This chart shows that President Trump has exceeded all previous presidents in his cabinet turnover in his first term, and he still has 1 year to go, or 3/4 of a year to go. There's a lot here, but simply note that after only 3 years, this administration has had greater turnover than the last 5 administrations have had in their first 4 years. And it is the only administration to replace a cabinet secretary in the first year, 2 in this case, with 5 more replacements in the second year. But it's not just picking a cabinet, it's getting them to work together, and that's process, and that's the role of the White House staff. This is President Trump's White House staff in his first week in office. In addition to the president and vice president, you have, in case you've forgotten who they are, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, Senior Advisor Steve Bannon, Spokesperson Sean Spicer, and National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. This team, during that transition period, participated in a role-playing exercise, sitting alongside the outgoing Obama administration. They had to walk through what they would do if there was an outbreak of a novel influenza epidemic. Even if this team had learned those lessons, by the summer of the first year, all of these staff, other than the president and vice president, would be replaced. As you saw in the Bush 41 clip, getting the national security team right is essential for managing processes, particularly amidst a crisis. That requires a strong chief of staff, national security advisor, and defense secretary. In my opinion, this was the strongest team that President Trump has had, and already all of them have been replaced. We also heard about the importance of a strong Secretary of State. President Trump's first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, served for just over 13 months. When processes don't work well, tragic things can happen. The following clip is from John Kennedy, who created an audio diary after the assassination of South Vietnam's president and vice president in early November 1963. Essentially, the cabinet process failed to send a clear signal to the South Vietnamese army about the advisability of a coup. This clip was taken from our presidential recordings program, which transcribes and analyzes the secret Oval Office recordings of the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administration. So please play the clip.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility, because Lodge shifted his station chief. And in favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Barstow at the White House. I feel that we must bear your responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. In my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. Well, we did redress that balance in later wires. That first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Diem and New in order to move them.
Hello.
This is a particularly poignant clip in two regards. About halfway through that audio diary, the president's son, John Kennedy Jr., John, as we came to know him, entered the Oval Office. It's secondly poignant in that 3 weeks later, President Kennedy himself would be assassinated. So having a well-oiled machine is really important in these moments, well managed by the White House. It's essential to effective government. The percentage of turmoil in the Trump White House has been higher than in previous administrations, not just turmoil, but turnover. If you look at this chart, you'll see that over 80% of Trump officials have come and gone. That number is only slightly higher than other administrations, which are in the 70s. These jobs are hard. Most White House staff serve for only about 2 years. I myself only served in the White House for 2 years. The jobs are 24/7, 365. But what is really quite extraordinary about the Trump White House staff is how much they turned over in the first 2 years. You'll see that nearly 40% in both the first and the second year, about 35% in the first year and 30% in the second year turned over. And that first year is much higher, practically double any previous administration before it. And the second year is also quite high. What is even more striking is how many levels into the bench the team went. If this is a depth chart on a football team, they are now often into the third or fourth string for many of these important positions. Now, that doesn't mean that some of these players are not particularly strong. Some actually have stepped up and in some ways are better than those who came before them. But it does mean that they're often new in the jobs and are still learning to work with one another 3.5 years in. Okay, now you've got your team in place and you're in a position to advance your priorities. What were President Trump's priorities? His promises were quite clear coming in at the outset of his presidency. He wanted to boost the economy with a significant tax cut. He wanted to stem immigration. He wanted to move forward on energy issues and trade issues. So let's go and see how he did. On the economy, he was able to pass two major actions in his first 3 years. The first he passed in the first year, which was the corporate and middle class tax cut. It took a while to renegotiate NAFTA, but he was able to pass that right in the middle of the impeachment crisis. He was also able to promote the use of fossil fuels and to reverse the Obama administration climate policies. He did those by executive action. On healthcare, he failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. However, he has been using a series of administrative actions to slow it down. He pledged to block immigration from predominantly Muslim countries and build a wall on the border with Mexico. He failed to get legislative approval for that, so he did both of those by executive action. And he claimed that he would declare China a currency manipulator on his first day and was going to challenge the Chinese on trade. He certainly challenged them on trade, negotiating a first phase of a new agreement, but he did not declare them a currency manipulator, saying that it was actually more complicated than most people knew. In foreign affairs, the president was going to put America first. His national security strategy, released in December of his first year, was quite clear. It had tough words about taking on traditional adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. His record on those four has been a checkerboard one, where he has followed through on tough rhetoric with China and Iran, but less so with North Korea and Russia. His relationship with President Putin in Russia has drawn extensive commentary. Most Republicans, despite their support for Trump, still see Putin as an adversary and a threat. Yet the minority of Republicans who support a more friendly policy toward Russia has been growing, with nearly 30% of Republicans no longer seeing Russia as an adversary. Official US government policy has been more wary of Russia than the president's rhetoric, with increased sanctions passed by both houses of Congress and support for Ukraine in its border conflict. But the president's rhetoric and his own executive actions in that regard obviously have been in a different place. He has had a rockier time with allies. With Canada, our largest trading partner, he has had cordial personal relations and has succeeded in renegotiating NAFTA. But the contrast in styles and approach has been stark. Among his European partners, relations have been even rockier. While often cordial, the president has regularly lashed out at Europeans, from trade to NATO to climate change, to immigration to diplomacy with Iran, and most recently to the coronavirus. NATO and G7 summits have been particularly turbulent affairs. Relations with Turkey are at their worst since the invasion of Cyprus in 1974. Populist and authoritarian governments within the alliance in the United States, UK, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey in particular, have shown less tolerance for multilateralism. That means that NATO, which already moves at a glacial bureaucratic pace, has even been slower to act, and it has made coordinating relations with Russia particularly difficult. No relationship has been worse than with Germany, though Chancellor Merkel was not part of the group that appeared to mock the president at a recent summit. The president and the chancellor's mutual disdain for one another has been on regular display. And finally, the coronavirus has been perhaps the ultimate presentation of all the dimensions of the Trump presidency. Despite a reasonably strong HHS secretary, initial White House coordination in the federal government was weak, and eventually the vice president stepped up, but some would say that the delay in the early days of the crisis, when a well-oiled machine might have helped, has really made the follow-up actions that much more difficult. The president's own ability to provide order and calm have also stymied efforts, including him often changing tack on one policy or another. Underlying all of this is the idea that the presidency is embedded in a constitutional system of checks and balances. While the president has considerable power at executive disposal, the system is designed to be most powerful when the executive and legislative work together. Of course, the framers intentionally divided those powers to limit its use. Still, one mark of an effective president is finding a way to work with Congress, whatever Congress the president has been given, whether of their own party or the other party. So this is a list of the first year accomplishments of the Trump administration in the far right column, compared with previous presidencies. Each presidency faced a different congressional makeup. Carter, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and Trump all had a Congress controlled by their own party, whereas Reagan and Bush 41 each faced Democratic control of both houses of Congress. The Trump administration accomplished the fewest signature legislative wins in its first year, even with Republicans controlling both houses of Congress. The president's defenders would argue that the tax cut and the Congressional Review Act, which allowed significant deregulation, were massive achievements, but the number is still meaningful, indicating that working directly with Congress has either not been a high priority or a strong suit of this administration. Moreover, the president subsequently secured both the renegotiation of NAFTA and a major overhaul of criminal justice laws, but they are still working on an emergency response to the coronavirus outbreak. There appears to be progress, but the deal isn't done yet. Like many presidents, President Trump had a significant setback in the 2018 midterm elections. This map of the country shows blue and red dots, each representing a congressional district. The 234 blue dots are Democrats in the House, and the 201 red dots are Republicans. The numbers have changed some due to resignations and switched affiliations, but the gap between Democrats and Republicans is still the same. And that involved a pickup of 41 seats for Democrats. The president's first 2 years essentially did two things. They moved the country to the left, but they also helped drive even greater polarization. Let me start with the polarization. The red arrows in this map show that about 80 congressional districts became more conservative. That is, each of these red arrows represents a growing share of votes going to Republican members of Congress from these districts. That is, in about 80 congressional districts for about 80 Republican members, less than half of the Republican caucus. Either more Republicans voted or more people voted Republican. So about 80 districts became redder. That is 80 out of a whole total of 435 districts. The president drove about 350 districts to the left for every single Democrat who was elected or reelected. Either more Democrats voted or more people voted Democratic. In about 100 districts held by Republicans, the share of people voting for Democrats also increased. That means districts that were once safely Republican are now a little less secure. Of course, the biggest difference was that 41 seats switched parties. That includes 36 new women members of Congress. A few of these are quite liberal. All of 3 of those circled here, the so-called squad, won seats that were already held by Democrats. So blue districts went bluer in this case. But 22 of these freshman women won formerly Republican districts. These members, almost by definition, are moderates. Most are in the suburbs and even exurbs. This ultimately played out in the recent impeachment hearings, both the polarization and the shift of Congress to the left. Some Democrats had been calling for the president to be impeached from his first days in office, but the tipping point moment came when 7 freshman members of Congress who had served in national security positions, in defense, intelligence, and diplomatic positions, came out in favor of the impeachment investigation. They emphasized their own oaths to protect and defend the Constitution, and all 7 are in swing districts. All of these voted to impeach the president. 5 of those 7 national security freshmen were part of the 22 new women members of Congress. Finally, how the president manages his personal approval ratings is the essential barometer of his importance, and obviously, as we move closer to election day, will help shape our expectations of what happens. To provide some historical context on re-election and popularity, let's look back over the 20th and 21st centuries. Since 1900, we've had 21 presidents. Of those, 4 died in office: McKinley, Harding, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Nixon resigned. 12 presidents won a second term, and I don't use the term re-elected because 4 of these, Teddy Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, and LBJ, were not elected the first time, or at least were not elected president. They were elected vice president. So they won a second term along with the other 8. Each had a rising economy at his back. Of course, there were others who lost. Taft, Hoover, Ford, Carter, and Bush 41 all faced slowing economies. And in addition to a weak economy, Carter was probably also hurt by the Iran hostage crisis. Let me show you how this president's popularity has been going. This is where the president has been quite historic. He's the only president since the advent of modern public opinion polling to never register above 50% popularity. Worth noting, the president has never exceeded 46, but he's also never fallen below 37%. That 9% gap is a huge difference come election day, of course. He was elected with just 46% of the vote, and that is still possible. But if he dips far below that, it will make re-election that much more difficult, and not just for the president, but also for down ballot races in the House and Senate, and even at the state level. So think of that 9% of vote between the 46% high and the 36% low, not as never Trumpers, but as sometime Trumpers. These are generally Republicans or certainly conservative leaning independents who want to support the president, but have struggled to do so. The president's strength as a general matter, and particularly among sometimes Trumpers, seems to come from his handling of the economy to date. And these opinion polls, I should note, and you'll see in the bottom, come from either late February or early March of this year. The 2 strongest numbers he's had, and let's set aside impeachment for a second, are economy and trade. In these 2 areas, the president's approval consistently exceeds 40%. By contrast, on immigration, health policy, and foreign policy, voters have been less forgiving. You should note here that I've put approve in red state red and disapprove in blue state blue. The impeachment numbers are a little hard to track because it depends what you are asking people for. This number represents the number of people who felt that the president should not just be impeached, but removed from office. If you ask people, were the president's actions severe enough to go through a trial, the number gets into the low to mid 50s. So let's take each of these issues in turn and how the president moving forward will be tested by this group and particularly the impact of the coronavirus. First, on the economy, Goldman Sachs predicts right now a 25% drop in GDP in the second quarter. The entire stock market gains of the Trump presidency have been eliminated. Global trade flows and the supply chain have been shattered. So in the coming weeks, watch that number. Second, setting the tone, the president's blunt and improvisational style, which he keeps his 37% loyal, may be ill-suited for the 9% when citizens are being called by state and local leaders to act with compassion for others. And in some ways, healthcare, immigration, and foreign policy as issues have a dimension of compassion and thinking about others in them. Finally, there's the role of government. The crisis demands a national solution. State and local leaders have stepped up, but all of them say that that's not enough. And the 9% may embrace technical expertise that seem at times to be at odds with the president. In short, the current crisis does offer him an opportunity to be what he's referred to himself as a wartime president, that is, someone dealing with a national security crisis. But this war may require a form of leadership that would comfort the 9%, but that may be difficult for this president, or at least where he has been inconsistent. If the perception is that President Trump's inaction, or worse, his ineptness, has deepened the crisis, similar to Jimmy Carter's handling of the Iranian hostage crisis amidst a recession, then voters may hold that against Trump. Of course, the wartime presidency model pushed both President Bush 41 and 43 to exceptional levels of popularity after the first Gulf War and after 9/11. This is the Bush 41 popularity chart. And you can see those moments of popularity in the early days of the various crises, both in Europe and then later in the Gulf, were high, but they were fleeting, especially when economic concerns weighed on voters toward the end of the Bush presidency. The numbers came back down to earth and then below the 50% mark. So the President Trump's own performance on these issues has sometimes moved in a direction that reverts back to him sounding defensive and short with reporters who've questioned his strategy and approach, particularly when it's come to the economy. Let's look at George W. Bush's popularity. In the days after 9/11, after the mission accomplished and after Saddam Hussein's capture, President Bush 43 had higher popularity spikes, but his popularity did less well with the handling of Katrina and then, of course, the financial crisis and the bailout at the end of his term. So what lessons does this hold for the Trump presidency? At least this presidency, the tracking with the George Bush presidency, he will have to collaborate with Congress. And Congress needs to be collaborative, but also has to appear to not be partisan when they disagree on policy. They will point to the president's missteps, poor decisions, and blame storming, but they have to appear to be doing so in a way that points forward a path for the rest of the country. So in conclusion, let me quickly summarize these 5 Ps and how the president has acted in the first 3 years and how it will shape the next 7 months. On personnel, for good or bad, the president now has the team that will serve him in the crisis. Secretary Pompeo, Mnuchin, Azar, Esper, and Barr are serious senior individuals. All 5 have struggled at times, however, with how to disagree with the president, which is essential in a moment of crisis. The White House team varies: a new chief of staff, a new national security advisor, and a fluid structure on COVID response, which may be appropriate. But the coming days will test this team like no other in President Trump's presidency. From a process standpoint, history will not judge the first 3 months of this crisis well. The structure of COVID response has been fluid. It is finally gelling, it appears, but the role of expertise and how it relates to the president's own instincts and his political considerations is still a work in progress. The frequent briefings the president has been doing had been providing a semblance of transparency and ballast, but evidently those are in transition as well, with the president taking the helm and experts being pushed back. On the priorities, obviously, the economy and public health are fighting for the president's attention. In retrospect, I think on the economy, historians will ask, was deepening our deficit to pursue tax cuts the best strategy? Was choosing confrontation over diplomacy helpful or harmful in a moment of collective need with our allies. And was frigid relations with Democrats in Congress really the way to set up a political situation in a moment of crisis? The president will have to work through all of those challenges in the next 7 months if he is to succeed. Staying for a moment on the politics, the president has largely ceded to his cabinet and to Congress coming up with a final deal, but he also comes back in at key moments to lend support or to indicate where he doesn't support. Whether that leads to a deal that translates into the kind of bipartisan political approval that other presidents have enjoyed in the past remains to be seen. And on the personal side, can President Trump continue to be Trump and still get reelected? Does he need to embrace a more inclusive tone and form of leadership? At some level, that's what we're all waiting to see, and those stakes go well beyond his presidency. So thanks for listening. I'm now going to go to my colleague, Mark Silverstone, who is the head of our presidential recordings program. Mark's going to grill me with a few questions. He's been really helpful for me in pulling this presentation together, not just the audio clip from President Kennedy, which is Mark's own personal expertise and which I stole from him, quite frankly, but also in helping me shape through everything from the 5 Ps to how to think about them in the current moment. So Mark, great to see you virtually, and thanks for stepping in to help.
Great, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for a really stimulating presentation. There's a lot to chew on, and I encourage everybody attending online to formulate questions and to submit them via the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. I'll kick things off, Bill, and sticking with your 5 Ps. In fact, I'd like to stay on that last one, because I think right now, as we're seeing President Trump more frequently, perhaps in person rather than online, although there is still a lot of tweeting that we're hearing, this question of whether Trump can be Trump. I'd like to hear you riff a bit more about how his strengths align with the challenges he's now facing as a crisis manager, or how his liabilities are more likely to be exposed in this environment. Is this a situation really in which he can leverage his strengths particularly effectively, or are the weaknesses more likely to come to the fore, particularly because of the nature of the challenges that he's now facing and we're facing together?
Well, it's a great question. I think we're all watching and learning. Look, bluntness, directness, not dealing with the niceties of bureaucracies actually can be really helpful in moments of crisis. First of all, in a military crisis, when you're facing an adversary that needs to hear clear messages, that kind of directness can be helpful. In this case, obviously, the main adversary is something that doesn't respond to blunt talk. It responds to soap and water and hand sanitizer. And I don't mean to be glib there, but there are other adversaries. Look, I think that individuals that don't obey orders when we come to things like quarantines or remain in place, bureaucratic laggards who are not responding well, parts of the economy which want to work in one way or another, which need to be directed. Sometimes clear and blunt speaking is absolutely required. But a modicum of that is also sometimes important, balanced with compassion. You're trying to motivate people to act not just in their self-interest, but in community interest. And we're all doing that. We're all staying home together. And that's challenging. And I think there needs to be a balancing of that. And I think the president, frankly, has been trying to modulate that, but has struggled with modulating it. Some of that is also him trying to figure out what serves his own personal popularity benefit and where are others on his team being enhanced. If you go back to the first Gulf War, we all, those of us old enough to remember Stormin' Norman Schwarzkopf, who had a huge amount of time on that fledgling television station, CNN. And he would explain how, with great military precision, our satellite and radar guided missile technology were able to strike bunkers with great precision. And that gave enormous confidence that the public invested in our military to execute this action, which frankly, in the wake of Vietnam, was something that was really necessary in the country. This was one of the biggest military engagements we had since Vietnam. There were a few smaller ones during the Reagan administration, but this was really quite an extraordinary undertaking. And I think it was really, really helpful. But in that case, that took attention and support away from the president and toward the military. And in this case, the president, who has often railed against the deep state, is seeing career government officials get attention and often disagree with him. And that seems to cut against his own ethos, which is only I can solve it. And I think he's wrestling with that, frankly.
Yeah, I've been impressed with his ability to let other people step out in front, particular Dr. Fauci or Deborah Birx, even Vice President Pence, placing him at the head of the task force initially, recognizing, as you say, it's a fluid structure. To me, that seemed like an evolution in his approach. Various people talk about presidents learning on the job. Kennedy was one famously that historians have pointed to as somebody who could learn on the job and evolved over the course of his presidency. And that seemed like it might have been a moment where President Trump was stepping into that, but perhaps more frequently now with the likelihood of more friction between President Trump and Dr. Fauci, that may be going in a different direction.
Let me say one thing about that. I want to echo the comment about Mike Pence in addition to Fauci, and Vice President Pence has played sort of a middle role here, having been a governor, having pulled this task force together, understanding the roles of the different agencies. He played this moderating force between the career officials and the political imperative. And he came in at a moment when some small few people were speculating about whether he would actually stay on after the convention to stay as the vice presidential candidate. Some speculation that President Trump might swap him out for somebody like Nikki Haley. I think he stood up and did a good job, with perhaps some liability that if he didn't do a good job, he could be dropped. I think it's really quite interesting that President Trump is keeping him in the briefings when the experts are being sidelined. And I would just pay attention to that, because he does play this middle role between the expertise of career government officials and the president's more political instincts.
Bill, here's a question that's come in. What do you think have been the most surprising aspects of the Trump presidency you've observed so far, particularly in the context of comparing this presidency to the 5 previous presidencies?
Well, I guess I would say that my personal surprise, particularly having watched the transition and the early days when he seemed to understand that this was a much bigger and more complex undertaking than he'd had before, and some reputation in New York of having trusted deputies, including quite a lot of women who would run particularly parts of his operation, who he would trust to get things done. His inability to truly trust people below him and work through so many people so quickly demonstrated less loyalty toward a core group of people than he had exhibited in his private business dealings. And I also think that, and maybe this was the switch in his business from actually owning and operating a number of facilities to simply licensing his name on facilities. He was much less operationally oriented as a president than he was about the marketing and branding. I think we're seeing more of Trump, the apprentice TV producer. We've seen more of the Trump apprentice TV producer more concerned about ratings than Trump as a real estate operator more concerned about operations and management.
Mm-hmm. Thinking more about how he addresses the intricacies of this crisis right now, there is a lot of back and forth between federal responsibilities and state responsibilities. and the need to try to get PPE, the personal protective equipment, to the medical professionals. And there's a lot of that tactical stuff going on, just the pure mechanics of how to address this crisis. Interestingly enough, as I understand it, President Trump will be conducting his own webinar of sorts today at noon, trying to address some of these concerns as part of a town hall. But beyond these tactical measures of fighting the crisis, there is the matter that lays ahead in the summer of politics and the campaign, and then also providing a vision to the country of where we will be when we come out of this on the other side. I wonder if you could talk to some of that, because it is a challenge of providing a vision for America that initially for him was encapsulated with the Make America Great slogan, reconditioned as Keep America Great. There is probably going to be some kind of a need to reformulate that phraseology now going forward. And while other presidents have self-admittedly struggled with the vision thing, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how Trump tries to define that for the race, but also for America as a society going forward.
Well, it's a great question, and let me take two different parts of it in turn. One is the state-local piece as it connects to the president, including the strange bipartisan politics going on there, and then the president's own messaging about those things. On the state and local dimension, look, I think every single one of us is seeing some dimension of governance in this crisis, at the family level, at the city level, at the organizational level. We as an organization, both the Miller Center and within UVA, are visiting rules and regulations about where we work, when we work, how we work. We're all managing kids with schools shutting down and who makes those calls and how the calls have ripple effects on work life and home life. You know, I think we've been really blessed at the university because the university, two things. One, we're realizing that we're both a university and a hospital health system. And we're making decisions on the university side that impact public health, not just here in the city of Charlottesville, but regionally. And in some ways, the university is making the most important decisions, health decisions for the entire region. I think the university was out in front of a lot of other operations, governments, and others in making these decisions because they realize that they have a trauma one hospital. So those decisions stack up and keep moving their way up the layer cake, or the wedding cake, if you will, and the federal government really sits atop that. But then this connects to the second part of the question, how the president is himself addressing. Oh, let me just say one thing before getting to the president. What you're seeing is governors, Democrats and Republicans, responding differently to this crisis. The biggest epicenters of the crisis are in 3 states that have largely Democratic governments and legislatures: New York, California, and Washington State. The crisis is now, as a healthcare crisis, spread across all 50 states. Different states are managing it differently. But a lot of Republican states and Republican governors, and I have been following closely Governor Kasich in Ohio, has been way out in front. Governor Mike DeWine now in Ohio, right? And former Governor Kasich, both of whom have been out in front, if not more in front than those blue states, in arguing for shutdown of workplace. Governor DeWine in Ohio canceled, over a court order, canceled the Democratic primary in that state, and Republican primary, which was uncontested. So you're seeing a number of governors stand for it. Then again, you're seeing in a few other states, at least lieutenant governors and others, saying that actually the economy is more important than the health crisis, which echoes some of the phrases that the president has been playing with in the last 24 hours or so. So you're seeing a diversity, but you're mostly seeing a bipartisan consensus toward more aggressive early action. So then we get to the president and his own rhetoric on this. First of all, he does need a new slogan. I mean, his slogan was going to be, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" That's going to be a lot harder to answer yes in November. almost no matter what happens in the crisis. I think most epidemiologists are thinking that even if there's a second bump that's not as big as the first bump, this is an 18-month crisis. It's going to have another tail bump to it. And that will extend at least through November. If you think about at least the second Gulf War, President of George W. Bush's Gulf War, there was the Intifada, the uprising in Iraq after the invasion, after the toppling of Saddam, after the capture and trial and execution of Saddam Hussein. The Intifada kicked up and expanded even further. And in some ways, that's going to be the second shock wave of this crisis, when at some time in the summer or fall, there will probably be a resurgence of the outbreak. There may not be. God hopes there isn't. God hopes that we come up with either a direct medicine to directly address the COVID-19, or some form of inoculation and vaccine that gets ahead of it. But most epidemiologists will tell you it takes 18 months to fully test out both of those things and make sure that they're safe to administer. Yeah. And short of truly some miracle cure, we are likely to see public health concerns for the foreseeable future. And I think that will have lag effects on the economy. I think that's what most people are planning for. And as a result, I think it's going to be hard for him to say you're better off than you were 4 years ago. So I think the messaging probably is going to have to be something like, I continue to lean into the economy to make sure it's better than it would have been. And I acted quickly enough to make sure that the crisis is not worse than it would have been.
And that he's providing the leadership to make sure that the executive and the legislative branches can work together, which you had pointed out is crucial for his success, and leads into a question that one of our viewers had about this issue of bipartisanship versus polarization. The level of polarization really seems to be something extraordinary. And again, one of our viewers wants to know whether other presidents have had to deal with this level of division.
Well, the second part of that is a great question. Let me just say that despite the polarization, which has been super intense, it is a testament to both Republicans and Democrats in both the House and Senate and in the administration, people like Steve Mnuchin, that they've been able to get a series of deals already, including one that's being actively negotiated right now. You know, for anyone that questioned whether it was important for people to serve in a Trump administration that has been so upsetting to so many people on the left and in the center, I think these people are really standing forward and are demonstrating the importance of public service in a crisis. And I think we have to applaud them, whatever our political views about them are. It may not be the response to the crisis that any of us wants, but we hope we get what we need, as the Rolling Stones used to say. But then let me talk about moving forward and the role of the president in this. You'll notice that the first deal was negotiated without the president's active involvement. That is good and bad. It's good in that it allowed for a deal to come forward, but a lot of Republicans in Congress were sitting on their hands waiting for the president to sign off on a deal. And if the president came out and signed off on a deal and the deal wasn't fully done in the Congress, that could also drive liberal Democrats away from the deal. So managing the president's own engagement in this has been a challenge. And to be quite frank and even fair to the president, a lot of Democrats are concerned that giving the president a deal that saves the place might actually save his presidency and get him reelected.
Right.
And frankly, if you're a Democrat and you feel that way, we as a country don't really have a choice. I think we have to come together and find some kind of accommodation and let the politics return to the politics and an assessment after the fact.
Yeah. One dimension of the politics has been the willingness of particularly Trump's core supporters, most ardent supporters, to support the president no matter what, regarding his difficulty with acknowledging specific facts or acknowledging expertise, as some would have it, acknowledging science. But in this particular crisis, there have been moments where there's been obvious division between what some of the experts are saying, particularly about potential therapies that might be available at some point, and the president's perspective on the ability of those therapies to materialize a lot sooner than the experts think they might. And so one question from one of our viewers, asks whether you can talk about that dissonance between what the president is saying and what the experts are saying, and the willingness of those viewers to simply side with the president no matter what.
Yeah, it is a big, complicated issue. And I know that's easy to say about a lot of these things. But public attitudes about science really are across the map in the country. They track with a number of different things, not just level of education, but how much people pay attention to the media, their own experiences with the healthcare system, including their own experiences with disease and therapy and cure. Remember, there are people across the spectrum that still challenge fluoride in water, who challenge the role of basic vaccines and its impact on things like attention disorders and I'm blanking on the phrase right now. And so what we have in this country are a mixed set of views about science. And people then get their news from a limited number of sources. And for many people, I would say roughly somewhere between 30 and 37% of the country, people resonate with the president's own attitudes about science. There are a number of different scientific issues in the public. Climate change is only one of them, but it's a fairly consistent one. And about the role of the private sector in delivering things directly to consumers without intermediating government agencies saying that they are safe and can be regulated. For the president's base of 37%, and even reaching into the 46% that have consistently supported him, and maybe even up to the 55% that like some of his actions on the economy, regulatory agencies have not been heroes, they have been villains. And the president and other media sources have helped villainize those. So it sometimes is not just the science, it's regulatory agencies getting in the way of things that might actually be safe, but they need the regulatory agencies need a level of certainty about the safety of those things that is higher than the public demands in a crisis. I'm not trying to excuse all of this, because some of this is simply know-nothingism, where people bury their heads in the sand, only get news from one news source. Those news sources often, and I'm not just talking about Fox News, I'm talking about InfoWars and others, who are so anti-science and so belligerent in attacking government officials or more traditional mainstream regulatory agencies and scientists to the point of being irresponsible. But I would say that there is a great diversity of views about science, and the president tacks in the direction of being skeptical of scientific expertise, particularly when attached to regulatory agencies.
Yeah. Sticking with that theme of core supporters and their willingness to go along with the president because it's the president who's saying it. President Trump has had this extraordinary ability, as some would see it, to unite the Republican Party. The strength of his support in the party, the numbers are just almost off the charts, seemingly, from a historical perspective. And one of our online attendees would like you to speak to that issue. The question is, Trump's effect on the Republican Party has been to unite it more than any previous president, while on the other side, the Democrats seem to be more divided and polarized than in the past. Can you speak to those divisions and the dynamics that are unifying seemingly the Republican Party at the same time?
Sure. I would on this probably defer to my mentor and old teacher and our colleague here at UVA, Larry Sabato. He knows this much better than I do. But I think the basic answer is that you have a smaller, more coherent Republican Party and a growing and more diverse Democratic Party. Republicans typically had been between, depending on which poll you use, between 31 to self-identified Republicans, 31 to 35% of the public. And now self-identified Republicans are 27% of the country, and they are 95% pro-Trump. What you're getting, if you go back to my 46 and 37% thing and the sometimes Trumper, many of those people, when it comes to the polling place, will end up voting for President Trump, 46%. But they don't call themselves Republicans anymore. They're quite skeptical of the president. And there are times when he issues a tweet that they don't agree with, that they say, I'm not a Republican anymore, even though when faced with a Democrat, they may end up still supporting the Democrat. On the Democratic side, what you see are a lot of former independents who now self-identify as Democrats. The Democratic number has grown a bit, but the people who are likely to think about voting Democratic, including voting in the Democratic primary, is much bigger. So you've seen much bigger turnout, particularly in the last set of states, once the Democrats have a single candidate. I will tell you, and Mark will affirm, that I was quite surprised at how quickly Democrats coalesced around Joe Biden. I thought we were looking at a brokered convention. And I thought that Bernie Sanders was going to go in, and the number 37% here is totally coincidental with what's happened on the Republican side. But I thought Bernie Sanders was going to go into the convention with 37% of the delegates, but the rest would be spread among a number of Democratic candidates. And eventually they would sort it out and they would pick a nominee. And I think what you saw was two things. One, a number of those Democrats thinking that that would be the exact way to lose to President Trump in the fall. And the second, once they coalesced behind Biden, a number of independents saying, okay, there's finally someone I can vote for. And they happen to be the most experienced and in some ways most centrist Democrat left standing. I can support Joe Biden. And so I would say that that's what's happening is you have a bigger and as a result, more diverse party. The bigger the tent, the more diverse it's going to be. The smaller the tent in the Republican case, the more committed and narrow it's going to be.
So we haven't said a lot about the Democrats in this conversation, and it's a broader conversation about the election. While the party hasn't formally settled on Joe Biden, it's certainly moving in that direction. And we don't have a lot of time left here, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the party decides to coalesce around Biden, how that might affect their ability to address this crisis, but also to present a vision for the country as the party that's the more responsible party, or the party that's more likely to lead the country effectively as we get onto the other side as well.
Well, let me say they're struggling to figure that out. I mean, on the one hand, the crisis, I think, contributed to, it wasn't the only thing, there were a number of pieces of this, but it contributed to the demise of Bernie Sanders and the rise of Joe Biden. I think that that's quite clear. The country got nervous. They decided they wanted somebody a little bit more responsible, and somebody who has been in a position of authority and who has been in an executive position other than being the mayor of Burlington. Nothing wrong with Burlington. It's a lovely college town. We live in a great college town. I don't think that being, and as I think the ultimate voter assessment of Pete Buttigieg is being mayor in a college town is not by itself qualification to become president of the United States. Right. And I think in this case, they flocked to Vice President Biden because he had been vice president and he had a managerial expertise. However, since the last primary, and even in the run up to the last primary election, it's been just impossible for him to get airtime. Right. I think the president, frankly, is squandering that opportunity. If he is using his airtime to continue to appeal to the 37% as opposed to the 46% or even a 51%, he's taking his opportunity vis-a-vis Joe Biden and he's wasting it. Mm-hmm. If he were acting, let me just say it, more vice presidential, more the way Mike Pence has been acting or the way Joe Biden has been acting, he might actually be able to expand above 46%. He has not yet done that. And he hasn't demonstrated, with the exception of half of one press conference, that he can do that.
We do have another question that's come in, and it speaks to one of the other dimensions of this crisis. And it is, as you have pointed out in the past, it's a series of crises that are all bundled together. It's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a national security crisis, it's a social crisis, and may become even more of a constitutional crisis as we go forward, as the country finds it challenging to get to the polls and for folks to cast their votes. In addition, for Congress simply to do its job and have the requisite number of people in the chambers to vote. What's the likelihood that states, to the extent that you know, will be more amenable to allowing people to vote by mail or by some other mechanism in the context of this pandemic?
It's a great question. And let me start on the democracy piece, but then also touch back on the economic and national security. And I'll take a step back on the democracy piece. I'm reminded, because I'm teaching a class in the fall with two of our Miller Center colleagues on democratic statecraft. The first time on record that the outbreak of a disease affected a democracy was in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. A plague breaks out in the early onset of the war within Athens. And Pericles himself gets sick and dies of the plague. Remember that in the Renaissance, when people were looking back to ancient Athens as the model for democracy, Rousseau defined a democracy, the perfect democracy, as a place where one could literally run to the public forum to cast their personal vote. So the personal intimacy of democracy has been wound up in this experiment of self-governance for 2,500 years. And plagues have been messing that up for 2,500 years. And in 1918, I don't know if anybody has read about this, when the Spanish flu happened. It happened during a midterm election year. And people were self-quarantining and doing a great job through the fall. And then they decided to go out and campaign again and come out from the polls. And it ended up contributing to, it wasn't the only factor, but it contributed to a resurgence of the Spanish flu in the fall of 1918. So I think we have to be very careful and aware. My understanding is that there are some funds identified in the latest recovery package to help states move to voting by mail. But it is a complicated system. I had a conversation with John Hager, who was former Lieutenant Governor and Speaker of the House, Republican here, a great UVA alum and a good friend of the Miller Center, who's on one of the state boards that governs elections. The managing of state elections is a big, complicated undertaking. It involves cities being involved, state level authorities, the certification of ballots. So any different change that gets made, even if authorized at the national level, has to get implemented at all these local levels. And imagine doing that when nobody can go to the office, right? We're going to have a series of Zoom meetings and then physically make that happen. So getting people to rush to the poll, and again, then there's the challenge of whether the Postal Service will be operational. I saw a story today that the Postal Service, because of declining use of the mail, is facing a funding crisis. Now, hopefully they will also be addressed in the bailout, but they are a semi-independent agency and they could go bankrupt. The hope is that they won't, but none of this is certain. And it goes back to the importance, not just of the president, but of bipartisan legislation that can address some of these challenges.
That's a lot to chew on and to consider as we think about electing our next president. I'd kick it back to you now. Wait, there's one more question that's just come in, and maybe we can squeeze this in, and perhaps this will be the last one, and we can end with your answer. The question is about how the president situates himself in an environment in which there is just a tremendous amount of opposition. And we have seen this over the past several presidencies, going back to the Clinton presidency and Bush 43 and Obama. It seems as though the rancor gets even more dramatic as we move forward in history. And in some ways, it speaks to the issue of polarization, as a previous guest had asked. Can you say some more about where this might all be headed? Is this inflection point that we're at right now perhaps an opportunity to dispel some of that? We seem to be at a juncture in American history, perhaps not unlike the Great Depression or another moment of great national challenge, where we are able to rally around as one, as a people, and put our differences aside a little bit. You spoke to that a little bit more, but this does seem to be something that we have not seen before, the crises that have kind of compounded or rolled on top of each other. And I'm wondering if perhaps we might end on a hopeful note and suggest that there really is this opportunity for us as a country.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take two parts of it, and I will end on a hopeful note, because I am hopeful, largely because of what I've seen from the ground up of people responding to the crisis. But I'll start with a stark statement of reality. We live in a divided and polarized society. There are an enormous number of people who think that the president, from the beginning of his administration, have been attacked by a deep state, by leftist press, by leftist academics, by essentially a small cabal of people who are out to bring him down. My own view is that that's actually about 55 to 60% of the country. Okay, I think that there's certainly a group of people that didn't like the president's style and tone and his policies. That is the 48 to 49% of people who vote for Democrats, whether they win or lose. But I do think there's another 10 to 15% of the country who value the importance of public service, who value the importance of science, and more traditional governance. I think that extends to the media. I think it extends to the career foreign service, career civil servants across various agencies, from the State Department to the Treasury Department to the CIA. My own experience in government forged a great network of friendships that go across the political spectrum well to the right. And I really value those friendships. Some of those people have become never Trumpers. Some of those people are sometimes Trumpers. And a few of those people are always Trumpers, including people serving in the current administration. But we are divided. There are a lot of people that don't trust that part of the society. And as I think we've seen from the people who are very committed to Bernie Sanders, that there are people on the left that don't trust not only President Trump and not only moderate Republicans. They don't trust business, big business or small business. They don't trust moderate Democrats. They see them as conceding too much. And so we have a very hardcore group of people on both sides of the country that don't trust media. That is a more generic general media. And I just happen to believe that it's partly because those people limit themselves to a certain set of voices, or because when they read other voices, they dismiss them. They dismiss them as fake news, and they don't source them. I tell all of my students, get information from as wide a range as you can, take courses as wide a set of faculty as you can. And I will tell anybody that thinks that media and or academia is hopelessly to the left, come to UVA. You will find terrific conservative faculty, independent faculty, and liberal faculty, all of whom are willing to listen to people across the political spectrum. And you'll find students that feel the same way. And that's what makes me hopeful. I think we've seen it here in Charlottesville and at the university. People have acted with enormous responsibility. You know, I go to restaurant. I've been spending all of the vacation money we were going to spend this spring and summer on takeout food because we live in Charlottesville, partly because we love the restaurants here. And, you know, we're spending what we would spend to keep them in business. And they show up and they've got rubber gloves on and they've got hand sanitizer and they've got sanitizing wipes that they wipe the containers that they hand over to us. And they don't take it personally that I'm bringing a sanitary wipe into the thing. And I think that ultimately the beauty of America, Alexis de Tocqueville discovered this just about 200 years ago, is that we discovered something at the local level, which is self-governance and self-interest rightly understood, what some people call enlightened self-interest. We have an ability to form civic associations from the ground up, but the tone of the federal government and of the president is extremely important, and hopefully those two things will meet.
Thanks. That's a wonderfully hopeful note to end on. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all your remarks today. And thanks for allowing me to participate and work with you in this conversation. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Same, Mark. And to everybody else out there, thank you for joining.